Gentlemen, ladies, I bid you welcome. My name is Edmund Warner Esquire, the upkeeper of Warner Manor and the noble image of the Warner family. I hope you enjoy this reading from my diary, which is currently being held up for me to read by my manservant, Baxter. Festive greetings, my dearest listeners, one and all. Although the big day has passed, I am still positively chock full of Christmas spirit. I do not know what you got up to on Christmas Day, and quite frankly, nor do I wish to know, lest your depressing holiday season tarnish one's good humour. Oh, goodness. I hope you didn't eat a dog or something awful like that. Anyway, I'm not here to reflect on your decrepit squalor, but rather to enrich your souls and show you there is good in the world by regaling you with the activities of my Christmas Day. Now, there is a lot to get through, so I would recommend you have an extra large pot of tea and some short biscuit to hand. Sit back and enjoy the Diary of Edmund Warner. Sunday, Christmas Day. Dear Diary, the day began in typical fashion with the service at St Paul's Cathedral. I was very disappointed to hear that the BBC chose not to film there once again, instead opting for Bristol Cathedral. Why on earth would anyone want to see that godforsaken hellhole on a Christmas morning? Paupers, scavengers and the diseased are a far from merry sight and certainly have nothing to do with Jesus. But that's the hippie Corbynites at the BBC for you. Bunch of ruddy lefts. Back to St Paul's though. The bishop was initially on top form with his sermon, talking about how financial lust was creating a stark rift in society between the rich elite and the less well off. He then went on to undo all his good work by suggesting this was somehow a bad thing. It did mar the service a little, I'll be honest, but I can happily say that our spirits were rejuvenated with a pitch-perfect rendition of Once in Royal David City, with the opening solo performed by Baxter's son of all people. A famously once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that none of us will forget. Unfortunately, I was finding the noise from the streets to be rather distracting my communion with the Lord, so I had Baxter go outside to quiet everyone down. Regrettably, just as his son was about to step up and sing. He felt disappointed for missing it, but you can't win them all, old chap. Next, it was back home and straight into the kitchens for Baxter, who was joining his army of maids with their attempts at a slap-up Christmas feast. The preparation looked in good order. 2 geese, 4 pheasants, and 2 peacocks were already on the roasting pan. But then Father exploded at Baxter. He'd only gone and forgot a ruddy turkey. Can you believe it? Of all the things to forget, Baxter goes and forgets the most important one of all. I wanted him horsewhipped then and there, but Father said he didn't want blood on the dining room floor. Anyhow, there wasn't a moment to lose. Myself, Father, and that incompetent buffoon Baxter hopped into the jeep, and by a stroke of luck, my brother Wilbur arrived home just in time to join us. We headed up Warner Hill to our turkey farm, where a fine selection was in store. The usual protocol is for myself, Father and Wilbur to brandish the thumb of Caesar as Baxter aims his rifle at the damned. This festive tradition has been a stalwart of Christmas Eves past, but this year, as it was Christmas Day, Father decided to spice things up by suggesting we pull the trigger to end their paltry lives. A most whimsical pun, which I must actually credit Father with. The big question was, which one to choose, dear listeners? I propose we just shoot them all and discard the less appealing carcasses, but Father said we wouldn't have enough room in the jeep for all of them. So after a few minutes of inspecting, we made our decision, and the lucky 5 were selected. Wilbur and Father are both expert marksmen and picked off the first 4 with ease. However, when old Edmund's turn came around, My slight inexperience showed, and I ended up firing at will, as it were. It's always disappointing when Baxter has to move away from other duties to clean up the carcasses of dead animals, but it was largely unavoidable in this instance, and to be honest, Baxter could use the cleaning practice. I did get a bit of gentle ribbing from Wilbur, as I should have done better, especially considering they were in a cage at the time. So, with the turkeys rifled and fired up in the oven, it was time for our guests to arrive. They consisted mainly of family friends, Gorhambury Prey Marshalwick, Whipsnade Stockwell, and the entire Caddington Dunstable family. Merry conversation ensued, and much laughter was had at the state of the Labour Party. Wilbur said, "What about the Lib Dems?" To which Gorhambury exclaimed, "Who?" We were ballywell bent over, double laughing. There was another guest who I hadn't met before, and was someone I took an instant disliking to. Bramminger Harpenden Flaskett. He came out with some atrocious statements, such things as, maybe Boris Johnson got it wrong with Europe. We might regret not having those strong trading connections. Well, I felt like covering the ladies' ears. What disgusting, filthy smuts to utter on a day of holy celebration! If that ghastly little squit's father hadn't been a close business associate of the family, I'd have had Wilbur box his ears in, the ruddy frog-hugging Europhile. I managed to promptly move the conversation on, as no doubt everyone in the room was ready to pounce on him, changing the topic to something that wouldn't cause controversy and would be an appropriate, jovial discussion point on this Christmas day. How women should in no way be vicars. Ah, phew, we were back to the undebatables. And not a moment too soon, because Baxter gave the call for luncheon, and through we went to the dining room. By golly gosh, it was gullet-patteringly scrumptious. The meat was plentiful and succulent, and not to mention the parsnips, Brussels sprouts, I daren't even look at Bramminger with the mention of Brussels, carrots, King Edward, or Edmund as we often jibe, roast potatoes, and a delicious blue whale pate. Forgive me for the frivolity, but all I can say is scrummy-wummy in my tummy. Admittedly, it was a little too much for all of us, and as we were looking full, you could see Baxter's team of maids eyeing up the leftovers for their lunch. But, in a rather cheeky mood, Father threw the remaining turkeys, pheasants and peacocks onto the lawn, heartily declaring, "A warning to the birds for next year." Frightfully funny, I do declare. So, a delicious feast was had by all, and despite, maybe occasionally, giving Baxter a bit of the iron sword, I had to hand it to him. He had done marvellously. In fact, I was tempted to let him go home early today to see his family. That was until he came and collected my plate from the right-hand side as opposed to the left. You'd think he would have some sense of proper waiting etiquette, but apparently not. So after publicly scolding him, I said that he had to stay for parlour games as well, in case we needed any assistance. And that was not before getting on with the desserts and ruddy washing up, the great big clumsy oaf. After lunch, we retired to the drawing room, where Wilbur, in his usual sporting mood, challenged the chaps to a game of Risk. Due to the large number of men in the room, we decided to play in pairs. I wanted Wilbur, but he said that would be unfair, as we were both so au fait with the game of Risk. I personally couldn't recall the last time I played, but I knew Wilbur's intentions were good, and he clearly ranked me as one of the better players. Instead, it was proposed we drew partners out of a hat. No, Baxter, boil the kettle. I'm going to want the drink. Just boil the kettle. I'm sorry, good listeners. Sadly, I had to cut recording because Baxter, the nincompoop, hadn't even started boiling the kettle. Anyway, I will pick up where I left off. Now that idiot has got his priorities in order. So, we drew partners out of a hat. An idea I initially approved of, until it emerged I was with that left-wing idiot Harpenden Flaskett. I then said that this method of picking teams was silly, and we should do it in a fairer way. However, I was met with group disagreement. Well, it was fine for them to say they weren't stuck with this Euro Johnny. After Wilbur told me to stop fussing, I ballywell hit boiling point. I went off to my bedroom to sulk for a good 10 minutes until Whipsnade Stockwell came up, saying he'd agree to go on Bramager's team. This made things a lot fairer, so I came back down and play resumed. Wilbur and I made a barnstorming team. Admittedly, I would have preferred to have had more say in the decision-making. Many of my suggestions weren't put into practice, but fortunately, as it turned out, Wilbur was often correct. So the joy of being on the winning team overrode my initial frustrations. After shaking hands, and in a truly festive spirit indulging in some seasonal gloating over our victory, it was time for the Christmas pudding. Now, earlier in the morning, my sister Amelia and I snuck down to the kitchen and filled Baxter's Christmas pudding mix with money from the charity collection pot from Father's work. A frightfully funny pun on the penny tradition, and Baxter, the silly goose, clearly didn't even notice. Once he brought it out and lit it, Amelia and I could not stop laughing and had to publicly explain our little ruse. Everyone was in fits of laughter, and the tears in Baxter's eyes were no doubt a result of the hilarity too. So, back off to the kitchen he went to prepare a new one. We all avidly watched the Queen's speech. This led to my second strop of the day. People laughed at me when I insisted on standing all the way through. Now, although everyone was laughing, I specifically aimed my anger at Harpenden Flaskett. I was mighty tempted to serve him a bunch of fives, but fortunately for him, the Queensberry rules were spared when Father told me to sit down and let people listen to the Queen. I know I should never have interrupted Her Royal Highness, even if it was to defend her reign against bureaucracy, and I hope she will accept my heartfelt apologies. Your Majesty, I am sorry. With the words of Elizabeth II resounding in our hearts, it was onwards to the next game, for which Mother suggested the women could join in with too. I voted for a bout of rugger, but Amelia won the favour of the crowd with her idea of whack the donkey. Mother pointed out that this was a good option, but the only drawback was there was no donkey. However, Holywell Caddington Dunstable said that we should use Baxter. What a frightfully good suggestion for a woman. That would make the game much fun for all involved. I stood by the door, and as Baxter walked in with the dessert, I stuck my leg out and tripped him up, spelling the end of his second Christmas pudding. He was then pinned down and blindfolded by Amelia and Mother, and his lashing about with amusement showed us he got the joke and was up for the game. We then started provincially beating him with rubber paddles. I wanted to get some of the jousting swords off the wall, but Father said he didn't want them broken. What I did find was a real wooden paddle from our boating collection, so I ballywell gave him a few wallops with that. After Baxter's excitement, we agreed it was time to call a day on his shift. So at 5 p.m, we kindly let him go home to spend Christmas Day with his family. Unfortunately, he was suffering from concussion and drove into a tree on his way out. After finishing clearing up the wrist set and indulging in a cup of Her Majesty's tea, we called for an ambulance and off he trotted to hospital. Now, as it is the season of goodwill, Father said he wouldn't charge Baxter for the damage to the tree until he was out of hospital. Oh, Father, always the Samaritan. Anyhow, nightfall was upon us and it was time for our guests to head home. I was rather exhausted, so at the gentlemanly hour of 6:30 p.m, one declared bed for oneself. Well, what a Christmas it was, and I will round it off by wishing all my dear listeners, for a final time this year, a Merry Christmas. And although I presume the best you got was probably a lump of coal, be thankful, because at least that will keep you warm through the night. Goodbye.